They called it the house that breathed, not because of ghosts, not because of creaking floorboards, but because, on certain nights, neighbors swore they heard faint exhalations seeping from the earth beneath it. A guttural, strained breathing, like lungs struggling against stone. It was 1889, deep in rural Georgia, when whispers began that the Whitfield family was hiding something in their cellar, something alive. Something pale, something they did not want the world to see. What began as rumors of illness became, over time, an unspoken terror that cloaked the entire town. No one dared ask questions. No one dared knock on that door after dusk. But decades later, when the house was abandoned and the cellar was finally forced open, the truth clawed its way into history, and what was found beneath that floorboards still stains the soil today. The Whitfields were not unlike other plantation-descended families of the Reconstruction era, white, land, rich, and desperate to cling to fading status. By 1889, they had already been reduced to whispers of former wealth. Their once grand estate sagged in disrepair, surrounded by red clay fields that had long since stopped yielding profit. But the family was not remembered for their debts. They were remembered for their secrecy. Jonathan Whitfield, the patriarch, was described as a rigid man with deep ties to the local church. His wife, Margaret, was spoken of less. Her silence was infamous, her absence from public life conspicuous. And yet they had children, 4 of them, all born between 1869 and 1874. But something about them, something the family never explained, was different. The children were rarely seen. And when they were, it was only in fleeting glimpses, figures in heavy veils, pale hands clutching at fabric, vanishing behind carriage curtains. Birth in the South was communal, a cause for neighbors to gather, to bring food and prayer. Yet when the Whitfield children were born, there were no celebrations, no baptismal feasts, no gifts of swaddling cloths. Each delivery was conducted in secrecy, behind locked doors, with midwives sworn to silence under threat of ruin. The first midwife, Sarah Ann Crawley, broke that silence only once before her sudden disappearance. She told her sister, trembling, that the child she delivered had skin the color of bone, hair like cobwebs spun too tightly, and eyes that did not take to the lantern light. "They don't blink right," she whispered, and when they looked at me, I felt as though something ancient had borrowed the body of a newborn. Sarah Ann's body was later found near the river, throat torn by something the coroner never identified. Officially, it was recorded as an animal attack. The townspeople learned not to ask questions after that. Every old Southern home has its cellar, but the Whitfield cellar was not for storing grain or wine. It was bricked in, reinforced with an iron lock so heavy it seemed designed for a prison. Neighbors noticed that while the upper floors of the house sagged into rot, the cellar door was always maintained. Polished, watched children dared each other to creep near it. They said that if you pressed your ear to the wood on certain nights, you would hear scratching from within. Not the scratch of rats, not the hollow drip of water, but the unmistakable clawing of fingernails, frantic and deliberate. The cellar was where the Whitfield children lived, for 20 years, hidden from sunlight, denied human contact, treated as shameful secrets instead of sons and daughters. When questioned by the church about their absent children, Jonathan Whitfield offered a single explanation: "The Lord has cursed our bloodline, we must not parade our shame." He claimed the children were unnatural, that to expose them to the town would invite Satan's mockery. The reverend, bound by the pieties of the era, nodded, and so the silence deepened. The Whitfields framed their cruelty as godliness, but behind that justification lay something darker, fear, not merely of ridicule, but of what their children might become if left unchecked. Some records suggest Jonathan consulted with physicians in Atlanta, men who studied albinism and other so-called curiosities of nature, yet no doctor ever laid eyes on the children. Some say Jonathan was told that such offspring were signs of ancestral sin. Others whisper that he was warned the children might not be entirely human. Section 6-20 would continue unfolding, with each layer peeling back suppressed truth. The children's descent into madness in the dark, the rituals Jonathan conducted over them, Margaret's quiet complicity, neighbors' suspicions, mysterious disappearances around the property, the cellar. eventually being opened in 1909 after the family line collapsed, and the pale, feral figures found within, neither fully human nor entirely other. The script would climax with the revelation that the children had created their own language, scratched into the walls in patterns resembling ancient symbols no one could translate. The final section would close with the house abandoned, the cellar sealed again, and the soil around it said to breathe on hot nights, as though the earth itself remembers what it swallowed. If Jonathan Whitfield was the iron fist, Margaret was the trembling shadow. Neighbors rarely saw her. When they did, her eyes were bloodshot, her movements sluggish, as if her body was weighed down by secrets too heavy to carry. In church, she sat stiff as stone, never singing, never smiling. Some whispered she had begged Jonathan to let the children see the light. But if she did, her pleas were silenced with a backhand. There are records of her buying milk in quantities too large for a family of two. Records of deliveries of salted meat, dried beans, and strange powders from apothecaries far from town. But the truth is written in her journal, found decades later in the ruins of the estate. Its pages, mottled with mildew, describe her shame in language at once biblical and fevered. They cry in the dark. Their voices are like broken flutes. They ask me why they cannot see the sun. I tell them they are unfit. I tell them their whiteness is unholy, but at night, when Jonathan sleeps, I hear them whisper to each other in words I do not know, and I fear they are learning a tongue older than mine. By 1891, animals began disappearing from neighboring farms. Chickens, dogs, goat, taken in the night. Tracks led toward the Whitfield estate, but they always stopped at the cellar's edge. The Whitfields explained the losses away with excuses: wolves, panthers, the scourge of the wild. But the farmers knew better. There were no wolves left in those parts, no panthers either. A neighbor boy claimed to have seen one of the children's faces in the dark while spying on the Whitfields' property. He swore its eyes reflected lantern, light like an animal's, and that its teeth gleamed too sharp, too white. No one believed him, until he went missing 3 months later. His body was never found, only his cap, soaked in mud, discovered near the Whitfield well. The local church prided itself on purity. The congregation knew whispers of the Whitfield children were true, but they also knew scandal would ruin them all. To acknowledge such abominations existed in their flock would draw unwanted attention from Atlanta, perhaps even Washington. And so, the Reverend struck a bargain with Jonathan. The children would remain hidden, never baptized, never named, never mentioned in sermons. In exchange, the Whitfields would continue to tithe generously, despite their dwindling fortune. It was an unholy silence masquerading as piety. The church became complicit in the cellar's darkness, and in doing so it ensured that no cries, no scratching, no pale hand pressed against a barred window would ever be acknowledged by God's people. As the years stretched on, the children grew, but their world remained bound by stone walls and damp earth. They were denied books, denied schooling, denied human society, yet somehow they developed a language. Carved into the cellar's beams were symbols, loops and intersecting lines, spirals nested within spirals. To outsiders, they resembled no known alphabet, but the children used them, whispering in a tongue of clicks and hisses, their voices weaving together in eerie unison. One visiting preacher who stayed overnight in the Whitfield home in 1895 claimed to have heard this language through the cellar floorboards. He fled before dawn, telling only his wife they were not speaking, they were chanting, as if to something that answered. He never returned to Georgia. In the summer of 1897, Margaret confessed to a neighbor during a thunderstorm. She claimed the children no longer feared the dark. Instead, they worshipped it. They touched the walls, she whispered, and they hummed to the earth, and sometimes the earth hums back. The neighbor told her husband, who laughed it off as hysteria, but when that same husband fell ill the following week, his skin blistering in strange white welts, Margaret was accused of witchcraft. The church turned suspicion toward her, though no charges were ever brought. Her journal tells the rest. I wake to find my own hair whitening in streaks. I fear their curse is leaking upward. I am their mother, but I am also their prison. God forgive me. By 1901, one of the children had died. Or at least that is what the Whitfields told the town. A funeral was held, but no coffin was ever opened. No body was ever shown, only a sealed box lowered into the red clay. Some whispered that the child had been buried alive. Others believed Jonathan had killed it to maintain control. But in her journal, Margaret writes, "The smallest one ceased to breathe, but its skin did not cool. It grew hot, too hot to touch. Jonathan would not let me open the shroud. He said it was no longer ours to bury." Weeks later, strange fires broke out in the fields near the Whitfield property, the soil glowing as though embers smoldered just beneath. In 1903, Margaret vanished. The official word was that she had gone to visit relatives in Charleston and never returned. But townsfolk knew better. She was gone overnight, her belongings left untouched, her journal abandoned mid-sentence. That final sentence read, "They have learned to open the door without the key." Some believed Jonathan killed her. Others thought the children pulled her into their dark, whispering world. Whatever the truth, Margaret Whitfield was never seen again. From that moment forward, Jonathan was the sole guardian of the cellar. With Margaret gone, the estate grew more hostile. Farmhands quit after hearing screams in the night. Visitors were driven away by an overwhelming stench near the cellar door, and still the town kept silent. Yet silence did not protect them. By 1905, 3 families reported newborns with unsettlingly pale skin, despite no trace of such ancestry. One child, born with eyes clouded entirely white, lived only 3 days. The townsfolk whispered that the Whitfield blood was seeping into the soil, poisoning the wombs of women who lived too close. By 1907, Jonathan was a husk of a man. His once commanding frame had withered. His sermons at church sounded more like confessions than proclamations. He spoke of shadows in the earth, of children who did not belong to him, of a covenant struck in darkness. One Sunday, he collapsed mid-sermon, frothing at the mouth. Witnesses swore his veins glowed white, visible beneath his skin like veins of marble. He died that night, alone in the decaying house. But when neighbors gathered to prepare his body, they found the cellar door wide open, and the lock, once strong iron, was shattered from within. The town gathered, fearful but curious. For 20 years they had whispered, but none had dared confront the truth. Now, with Jonathan gone, they could no longer avoid it. Lanterns were lit, shovels and rifles carried, and the cellar door creaked wide. What they found inside was not 4 children. It was 3 pale figures, elongated by years of confinement, their bones twisted, their skin nearly translucent. Their eyes glowed faintly in the lantern light, unblinking. And on the walls, every inch of stone, was carved the language they had created, spirals, lines, symbols that seemed to move in the lantern light, a language no one could read, but everyone could feel in their bones. The carvings were studied, copied, feared. Some swore they resembled petroglyphs found in caves older than the Cherokee, older than recorded history. Others claimed they pulsed when touched, vibrating faintly, as though alive. But the figures, these not quite children, did not resist. They only stared with expressions neither human nor animal, their lips curling into faint, knowing smiles, and then they spoke, not in English, not in any tongue heard before, but together in unison, a sound that rattled the lantern flames and sent grown men fleeing into the night. The remaining Whitfield children were taken to an orphanage in Atlanta. Records list them only as unfit for integration, their condition described as albinic degeneracy with signs of advanced neurosis. Within months, the orphanage burned to the ground. No bodies were ever recovered. Locals believe the children had not perished, that they had simply walked into the night, carrying their language with them, seeding it into the cracks of the world. After 1909, the town of Fairview, Georgia, ceased to speak of the Whitfields. The house was abandoned, left to rot. The church, once complicit, preached only of forgiveness and silence, but families continued to leave. Fields refused to yield crops. Livestock died in strange ways, their blood drained, their bones brittle. By 1920, Fairview was nearly a ghost town, its history erased, its records buried. All because of one family's cellar. The house eventually collapsed, but the cellar remained. Hunters who camped nearby reported the ground sometimes shifted, as if rising and falling with breath. On hot summer nights, mist would escape the cracks, curling white against the sky. Some swore they heard whispers in that mist, whispers in a language no one could translate, a language that seemed to promise not death, but return. Today, little remains of the Whitfield estate, a few stones, the scar of a foundation, but locals will tell you, quietly, reluctantly, that the soil there is still wrong, too pale, too cold, and if you press your ear to the earth, you might still hear breathing. The Whitfields tried to bury their shame, the church tried to silence it, the town tried to forget it, but the children endured, growing into something beyond human, beyond history, and the truth is this: some secrets do not die. They wait, they whisper, they carve their words into the bones of the earth, and one day they will be read aloud again.